I never thought I'd be sitting here telling this story. Most days, I'm still not sure if I should. But there comes a point when keeping something like this inside starts to feel like a betrayal. Not just to myself, but to everyone who needs to hear it. My name is Michael Dawson, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army 10th Mountain Division, deployed to Wardak Province, Afghanistan in 2011. I was 28 years old then. Thought I had life figured out. Thought I understood the world and my place in it. I was wrong about pretty much everything. Before I get into what happened, I need you to understand something. I'm not religious. Never was. My mom dragged me to church a few times when I was a kid, but it never stuck. By the time I enlisted at 19, I was what you'd call a practical guy. I believed in what I could see, touch, measure. The rest was just stories people tell themselves to feel better about dying. So what I'm about to tell you, this isn't coming from some place of faith or wishful thinking. This is just what happened to me, what I experienced, and I've spent every day since trying to make sense of it. Afghanistan was my second deployment. I'd done a tour in Iraq in 2007, mostly routine stuff, convoy security, a few raids, nothing too intense. I came home thinking I knew what war was. Then Wardak Province happened. Our firebase sat in a valley surrounded by mountains that seemed to scrape the sky. Beautiful country, actually. The kind of harsh, rugged beauty that makes you feel small. In another life, maybe it would have been a place for hikers and photographers. Instead, it was a place where the Chinooks would bring in flag-draped caskets and fly them back out. My squad was tight, 11 guys I would have died for without hesitation. There was Martinez, our medic, always carrying twice his weight in medical supplies because he couldn't stand the thought of not having what someone needed. Reynolds, the radio man, who kept a picture of his newborn daughter taped inside his helmet. Williamson, our sniper, who could tell you the wind speed by watching dust move across a ridge. And Chen, my second in command, who'd been with me since basic and could finish my sentences before I could. We'd been in country for about 4 months when it happened. 4 months of patrols, firefights, IEDs, and too many close calls. The locals in our AO were a mix. Some friendly, some hostile, most just trying to survive another day caught between Taliban threats and American promises. The morning it happened was actually peaceful. That's the thing that still gets me. It was a beautiful day. Clear blue sky, temperature in the high 70s, light breeze. The kind of morning where back home, you grab a coffee and sit on your porch. We were heading out on a routine patrol, moving through a small village about 3 clicks from our fire base. The mission was simple. Presence patrol, meet with local elders, gather intel on Taliban movement in the area. Standard counterinsurgency stuff. I remember checking my gear one last time before we headed out. Body armor, ammo, radio, first aid kit. The weight was so familiar by then, I barely noticed it anymore. 35 pounds of equipment that had become like a second skin. "Hey, Sarge," Martinez called out as we were mounting up. "I got a weird feeling about today." I laughed it off. "You get a weird feeling every day, Doc." "Yeah, but today feels different," he insisted, adjusting his aid bag. "Different good or different bad?" Chen asked, chambering around in his M4. Martinez shrugged. "Just different." I should have listened. In combat, intuition isn't some mystical thing. It's your brain processing 1,000 tiny details your conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. But I was tired, we were all tired, and the mission clock was ticking. "Keep your eyes open and we'll be fine," I told them, pulling my helmet on. Same as always. We moved out at 0700, 2 vehicles and 11 men. Standard patrol formation, keeping our intervals, watching the rooftops and windows as we passed through the village. The locals were already up and moving. Kids playing in the dirt, women carrying water, old men sitting in the shade drinking tea. Normal life going on in the shadow of war. I remember this one little boy, couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, standing by the road as we passed. He was holding something, a toy car made from wire and scraps. He waved at us and Reynolds waved back. Just a normal moment. Human. 3 hours later, Reynolds would be dead, and that moment would be frozen in my mind forever. The meeting with the village elders went about how these things usually go. We sat cross-legged on rugs in the headman's compound, drank 2 sweet chai tea, and talked through our interpreter about security concerns, local needs, and whether they'd seen any suspicious persons in the area. The usual dance. The headman, an older guy with a white beard and deeply lined face, seemed more nervous than usual. His eyes kept darting to the door, and he was answering questions before our interpreter had fully translated them. "Something's off," Chen whispered to me about an hour in. I nodded. I'd felt it too. Wrap it up, I told our interpreter. Tell them we appreciate their time and we'll be back next week. As we were getting up to leave, the old man grabbed my wrist. Through the interpreter, he said, "Different path back, not same way you came." I asked him why, but he just shook his head and repeated, "Different path." In hindsight, he was trying to help us. Maybe he knew something was being planned. Maybe he'd seen strangers in the village. Maybe he just had the same gut feeling Martinez had. Whatever it was, I made a decision that I've replayed in my mind a million times since. We stick to the planned route. I told the squad as we mounted up. Keep tight intervals, stay alert. The thing about Afghanistan, about combat in general, is that danger rarely announces itself. There's no dramatic music like in the movies. No slow motion moments where you can see it coming. 1 second, you're moving down a dusty road thinking about what's for dinner at the mess hall, and the next second, the world explodes. We were about halfway back to base, moving through a narrow section of road with mud brick buildings on either side. Classic ambush territory. We knew it, but it was the most direct route back, and we'd used it dozens of times before without incident. I was in the lead vehicle, standing up in the turret, scanning rooftops through my optics. Everything looked normal. Kids playing, women hanging laundry, old men smoking, the usual. Then I saw it, a slight movement on a rooftop about 100 meters ahead. Just a shadow, really. Nothing I could even properly identify. But something in my gut clenched. I keyed my radio. All elements, possible movement, rooftop at my 11 o'clock. Before anyone could respond, the world turned upside down. The first RPG hit the ground about 10 meters in front of our vehicle, close enough that the concussion rocked us, but the armor did its job. Training kicked in instantly. Contact front. I shouted into the radio. Multiple shooters, buildings on both sides. The second RPG is the one that got us. It came from a different direction. Our right flank, from a building we'd already cleared visually. Later, they told me it was a perfect shot, hitting just where the armor was weakest. I didn't see it coming. Just heard Reynolds yell, "RPG right," and then the world went white. The explosion picked me up and threw me like I was made of paper. Time stretched in that strange way it does in extreme moments. I remember seeing the sky rotating above me. I remember thinking, I'm outside the vehicle now, with a weird, detached clarity. I remember the sudden absence of sound, like someone had pressed mute on the world. Then I hit the ground and everything came rushing back at once. The noise, the pain, the chaos. I couldn't move. Something was wrong with my legs. I couldn't feel them. My chest felt like someone was sitting on it, and each breath was a struggle. I tried to reach for my weapon, but my right arm wouldn't respond. Through the ringing in my ears, I could hear gunfire, shouting, another explosion. Martinez appeared above me, his face streaked with dirt and blood. His mouth was moving, but I couldn't make out the words. He was cutting away my body armor, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency that had saved so many lives before. I tried to ask about the others, but I couldn't form the words. The pain was starting to register now, washing over me in waves. I could taste blood in my mouth, metallic and warm. Martinez was working frantically, inserting an IV, applying pressure somewhere on my body. I could see his lips forming the words, "Stay with me, Sarge. Stay with me." I wanted to tell him I was trying. I wanted to get up, to grab my weapon, to help the others. But my body wouldn't respond. The sky above me was so blue, so impossibly blue. I found myself staring at it, watching a single cloud drift slowly across my field of vision. That's when the strangest feeling came over me. The pain was still there, but it seemed distant somehow, like it belonged to someone else. A profound calm settled over me, even as I could see and hear the battle raging around my broken body. I remember thinking, with perfect clarity, so this is how it ends. No fear, no panic, just a quiet acceptance that surprised me even as I felt it. Martinez's face appeared again, more desperate now. I could see his lips forming different words. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare, Dawson." I wanted to tell him it was okay, that I wasn't afraid, but the world was getting dimmer, the sounds more muffled. Martinez's face blurred and then resolved again. He was shouting at someone else now, his hands covered in blood. My blood. And then, everything stopped. The gunfire, the shouting, the pain, Martinez's desperate work, it all just paused, like someone had hit pause on a movie. I felt myself rising, not my body that was still on the ground, with Martinez hunched over it, but me, whatever me, actually is. I was floating upward, looking down at the scene. I could see my squad returning fire from whatever cover they could find. I could see Reynolds' body slumped over in the vehicle. I could see my own body broken and bloody with Martinez fighting to keep it alive. It should have been terrifying. It wasn't. It was peaceful. I felt no attachment to the body below, no urgency about the battle, just a curious detachment, like I was watching a movie about someone else's life. As I rose higher, the scene below began to fade, not into darkness, but into a soft white light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then I saw my life. Not in the way you'd think. Not like a movie playing from beginning to end. It was all at once, every moment simultaneously. My 5th birthday party, my first kiss, the day I enlisted, my worst firefight in Iraq, the last time I saw my mother, every moment, good and bad, playing not in sequence but in parallel, like they were all happening right now. And I wasn't just seeing these moments, I was reliving them, feeling everything I'd felt, but also feeling how others had felt. I felt my mother's pride and fear when I enlisted. I felt my girlfriend's heartbreak when I broke up with her before deploying. I felt the terror of an Iraqi civilian when our patrol entered his home. Every action, every choice I'd ever made, I experienced from all sides at once. Every kindness, every cruelty, every moment of courage, every failure of nerve, all of it laid bare. Not with judgment, but with perfect understanding. I saw how it all connected. How a moment of kindness to a stranger had rippled outward in ways I'd never known. How harsh words spoken in anger had wounded deeper than I'd intended. How the smallest choices had shaped not just my life, but the lives of everyone around me. It was overwhelming, beautiful and terrible at the same time. Too much to process, too much to bear. And yet I wasn't afraid. I felt held assistant, supported, like I was in the presence of something that understood everything about me, my flaws, my failures, my struggles, and loved me anyway. Completely, unconditionally. I can't describe it adequately. Human language doesn't have the words for what I experienced. The closest I can come is to say it felt like coming home. Like I'd been homesick my entire life without knowing it, and suddenly I was where I belonged. Time didn't exist there. It could have been seconds or centuries. It felt like both and neither. I was aware of something vast, a presence that surrounded and permeated everything. Not a person, not a God in the way I'd been taught to think of one, but consciousness, pure awareness. Love as a fundamental force, as real and universal as gravity. And in that presence, I understood that I was both infinitely small and infinitely significant, that we all are. That the universe is not cold and random, but alive and aware and purposeful. I know how this sounds. Believe me, no one was more skeptical about this kind of thing than I was. If someone had told me this story before it happened to me, I'd have nodded politely while thinking they were either lying or crazy. But this was more real than anything I've ever experienced, more real than the keyboard I'm typing on now, more real than the chair I'm sitting in. As I floated in this state of perfect understanding, I became aware of others. Not people exactly, but presences. Some felt familiar, like souls I'd known before. One in particular seemed to be waiting for me. A presence that felt like my grandfather, who had died when I was 12. Not his appearance, but his essence. His humor, his kindness, his strength. He didn't speak in words, but I understood him perfectly. He showed me that this was not yet my time. That I had more to do, more to experience, more to give. That I was being sent back. I didn't want to go. This place, this state of being felt like where I belonged. The thought of returning to pain, to limitation, to the narrow perspective of human life was devastating. I tried to resist, to stay in that perfect light. That's when I was shown why I needed to return. Not just vague ideas about unfinished business, but specific things I was meant to do. People I was meant to help. I saw how my life connected to others in a vast web of purpose and meaning. I saw that what seemed random and chaotic from a human perspective was actually intricately ordered from this higher vantage point. And I was given a message. Not in words, but in understanding that settled deep into my being. A truth that I was meant to bring back and share. Before I could fully grasp it, I felt myself being pulled back. The light began to recede, or I began to move away from it. The presences that had surrounded me started to fade. I tried to hold on to the message, the understanding, knowing it would be harder to access once I was back in my body. The return was not gentle. It felt like being squeezed through a keyhole, compressed from all sides. The expansive awareness I'd experienced began to contract, narrowing down to human consciousness again. And with that narrowing came the return of pain, of limitation, of linear time. I slammed back into my body with a jolt that felt like electricity. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Every nerve ending screamed at once. I could hear voices again. Urgent, professional voices using medical terminology I only half understood. He's back. I've got a pulse. BP's 80/40 and dropping. We need to move now. 2 units ONEG hanging. Where's that medevac? I tried to open my eyes, but they felt welded shut. I tried to speak, but there was something in my throat. I could feel hands on me, moving me, working on me. The pain was beyond anything I'd ever experienced, but underneath it was something else. A certainty, a purpose, a knowing. I was alive. Against all odds, I was alive. And I had been sent back with a message. The next few days, or was it weeks, passed in a blur of surgeries, medications, and fleeting moments of consciousness. I'd wake up for a few minutes or hours, try to speak, and slip back under. Each time I surfaced, I'd struggle to hold on to what I'd experienced, afraid it would slip away like a dream. But it didn't fade. Unlike dreams which dissolve in the light of day, this experience remained crystal clear. Every detail, every feeling, every insight, all of it stayed with me, as real and solid as my memories of Afghanistan, of my childhood, of yesterday. I learned later that I had died, clinically died, for just over 4 minutes before Martinez and the combat medics who arrived with the QRF managed to restart my heart. My injuries were extensive. Shrapnel wounds throughout my right side, a collapsed lung, internal bleeding, and a traumatic brain injury from the concussion of the blast. By all medical logic, I shouldn't have survived long enough to reach the field hospital at Bagram. When I finally woke up properly, 2 weeks after the attack, the first face I saw was Martinez, sitting by my bed with dark circles under his eyes. "Welcome back to the land of the living, you stubborn son of a bitch," he said, his voice cracking slightly. I tried to speak, but my throat was raw from the ventilator they'd just removed. Martinez offered me ice chips, which felt like heaven on my parched lips. "Reynolds?" I managed to ask, though I already knew the answer. Martinez's face told me everything. "Williamson and Chen, too," he said quietly. 3 of my men, 3 friends who wouldn't be going home. The grief hit me like a physical blow, tangling with the profound peace I'd brought back from wherever I'd been. It was a strange contradiction. This deep sadness alongside an equally deep certainty that death was not the end, that my friends were okay in some fundamental way I couldn't fully explain. "You were gone, Sarge," Martinez said after a long silence. "I lost you on that road. No pulse, no breathing. You were gone." He looked down at his hands. "I've seen men die before, but with you, I just couldn't accept it. I kept working even when I knew it was hopeless." I wanted to tell him then, about the light, about seeing my whole life, about the message I'd been given. But I didn't have the words yet, or the strength. And a part of me was afraid he'd think the TBI had scrambled my brain, that what I'd experienced was just misfiring neurons in a dying brain. So I just squeezed his hand with what little strength I had and said, "Thank you." The next few months were a grueling cycle of surgeries, physical therapy, and psychological evaluations. The doctors were amazed by my recovery, especially from the TBI, which they'd expected to leave me with significant cognitive impairment. Instead, my brain scans showed unusual activity, patterns they couldn't quite explain. "It's like your brain is rewiring itself," one neurologist told me, looking at my scans with a puzzled expression. "I've never seen anything like it." I wasn't surprised. I felt different, not just physically but mentally. My thoughts were clearer somehow, more ordered. I could remember things with perfect detail. I could sense connections between ideas that would have eluded me before. And most strikingly, I could sense what others were feeling with an accuracy that sometimes frightened me. Through it all, I kept the full extent of my experience private. I mentioned brief flashes to the military psychologists, enough to be noted in my file, but not enough to raise red flags about my mental state. I wasn't ready to share it, not fully. I needed to understand it myself first. 6 months after the attack, I was medically retired from the Army with a Purple Heart and a disability rating that would provide for my basic needs. My physical recovery was remarkable but incomplete. I walked with a slight limp from nerve damage in my right leg, and I'd lost some fine motor control in my right hand. Small prices to pay for coming back from the dead. Coming home was difficult. My parents had moved to Florida while I was deployed, so I didn't have a hometown to return to. I rented a small apartment near the VA hospital in San Antonio, where I was still receiving regular treatment. I lived alone, spoke to almost no one outside of my medical appointments, and spent most of my time trying to make sense of what had happened to me. I read everything I could find about near-death experiences. Some accounts resonated with aspects of what I'd experienced, but none captured the full depth and clarity of it. I read about quantum physics, trying to understand the nature of consciousness. I explored religious and spiritual traditions from around the world, looking for frameworks that might help me contextualize what I'd seen and felt. And all the while, the message I'd been given, the understanding I'd been meant to bring back, burned inside me, demanding to be shared. But how? Who would listen to a broken soldier talking about life after death? Who would believe me? The turning point came about a year after I'd been wounded. I was at the VA for a routine checkup when I ran into the mother of one of my fallen soldiers, Staff Sergeant William Chen's mom. She recognized me from the funeral, where I'd been in a wheelchair, still heavily medicated and barely conscious of my surroundings. "Sergeant Dawson?" she said, approaching me in the hospital lobby. "I'm William's mother, Linda Chen." I froze. What could I possibly say to this woman whose son had died under my command? What words could possibly matter? But she didn't wait for me to speak. She hugged me, a fierce, maternal embrace that broke through all my defenses. "William visits me," she said when she finally pulled back, her eyes wet but steady. "In dreams. He says he's okay. He says you all did everything right that day, that nothing could have prevented what happened." I stared at her, speechless. Had Chen somehow reached her from wherever we go after death? Or was this just a grieving mother's way of coping with unbearable loss? "I know how it sounds," she continued, seeming to read my thoughts. "My husband thinks I'm just dreaming what I want to hear. Maybe he's right, but these dreams, they're different. They feel real. William tells me things he couldn't possibly know." "Like what?" I managed to ask. "Like that you died too, but came back. That you saw something important." She took my hand. "He said you'd understand." In that moment, something shifted inside me. If Chen was somehow communicating with his mother, and I believed he was, then the message I'd been given wasn't just for me, it was meant to be shared. I invited Mrs. Chen for coffee in the hospital cafeteria, and for the first time, I told someone the full story of what I'd experienced. I told her about the light, about seeing my entire life at once, about the profound love and acceptance I'd felt. I told her about sensing presences, including one that might have been her son. And I told her about being sent back with a purpose, a message. She listened without interruption, tears streaming down her face. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "That's exactly what William said you'd tell me," she whispered. "He said you'd seen the truth." We talked for hours that day. She shared her dreams of Chen in detail, how he appeared healthy and whole, how he spoke of a place of light and learning, how he assured her he was not gone, but just in another room, as she put it. By the time we parted, I knew what I had to do. The message I'd been given wasn't meant to be hoarded or hidden away out of fear of ridicule. It was meant to be shared, especially with those who were suffering, those who had lost loved ones, those who feared death or questioned the purpose of life. The message was simple but profound. We don't end. Consciousness continues. Love is the fundamental reality underlying everything. The connections between us are real and permanent. And everything has meaning and purpose, even the darkest and most painful experiences. I started small, a support group for veterans with PTSD at the local VA. I didn't lead with the spiritual aspects of my experience, but focused on the perspective it had given me on trauma, on loss, on finding meaning in suffering. Gradually, as trust built, I shared more of my story. To my surprise, I wasn't met with skepticism or mockery. Instead, my story resonated with something deep in the people who heard it. Many had experienced smaller versions of what I had. Moments of unusual clarity during combat, sensing the presence of fallen comrades, inexplicable knowings or premonitions. My experience gave them permission to acknowledge these things, to see them not as weaknesses or delusions, but as glimpses of a larger reality. Word spread. I was invited to speak at other veterans groups, then at hospices, grief support organizations, hospitals. I never sought publicity or profit. This wasn't about me, but about the message I'd been entrusted with. I lived simply on my disability benefits and occasional speaking fees, which I mostly donated to veterans' causes. Not everyone believed me, of course. I encountered plenty of skepticism, some of it hostile. Medical professionals suggested I'd experienced a hallucination caused by oxygen deprivation and trauma. Religious authorities were divided. Some embraced my story as confirmation of their teachings, Others condemned it as heretical or demonic. I didn't argue with the skeptics. I simply shared what I'd experienced and let people make of it what they would. Those who were ready to hear it, heard it. Those who weren't, didn't. That's how truth works, I've found. It waits patiently to be recognized. Over time, I connected with researchers studying near-death experiences, contributing my account to their data. I met others who'd had similar experiences. Not just soldiers, but accident survivors, cardiac patients, people who'd nearly drowned. Each story was unique, filtered through the individual's background and beliefs, but the core elements were strikingly consistent. Something profound happens when we die. Something that suggests consciousness is not produced by the brain, but merely channeled through it. Something that hints at a purpose and design to existence that transcends our limited human understanding. I'm telling this story now because the world needs to hear it more than ever. We live in a time of division, fear, and despair. People are losing their sense of meaning, their belief in something larger than themselves, their hope for the future. The materialism that dominates our culture tells us we're just complex machines destined for oblivion, that love is just chemistry, that meaning is just something we invent to comfort ourselves. What I experience shows a different reality. We are not alone. We are not meaningless. We are not temporary. The love we feel for each other is the closest we come in this life to touching the fundamental truth of existence. I don't claim special knowledge or authority. I'm just a soldier who died and came back with a story to tell. But it's a story that resonates across cultural, religious, and ideological boundaries. It's a story that speaks to something we all sense, deep down, beneath the noise and distraction of daily life. This is where I'll pause for now. There's more to tell about the specific ways my experience changed me, about the validations I received that convinced me it wasn't just a hallucination, about the deeper insights into the nature of reality that continue to unfold in me. But those are for another time. For now, I'll just say this. Death is not what we think it is. Life is more meaningful than we dare to hope. And love is the thread that connects everything, the force that survives when everything else falls away. I know because I died, and I came back to tell you. I've been speaking for a while now, and I realize I haven't touched my coffee. It's gone cold. Funny how time slips away when you're trying to put the indescribable into words. Before I continue, I want to clarify something. When I talk about coming back with a message, I don't mean I returned with some dramatic revelation or prophecy. I wasn't given the winning lottery numbers or told when the world would end. What I brought back was both simpler and more profound. A different way of seeing reality itself. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me pick up where I left off. After my conversation with William Chen's mother, something changed in me. The burden of keeping my experience private lifted, and with it came a new sense of purpose. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, I felt like I was truly alive again. Not just going through the motions of recovery and rehabilitation. I began speaking about my experience cautiously at first, in small groups of veterans and bereaved military families, people who, like Mrs. Chen, had lost someone and were desperate for reassurance that death wasn't the end. These were intimate conversations, usually with no more than a dozen people, often in the back rooms of VA hospitals or in community centers near military bases. What struck me most during these early talks was how many people had experiences they'd never shared with anyone. Not full-blown NDEs like mine, but moments that had hinted at something beyond the material world. Sensing the presence of deceased loved ones, inexplicable knowings, profound spiritual experiences during combat. They'd kept these experiences secret, afraid of being ridiculed or diagnosed with PTSD-related delusions. One Marine, a hard-bitten gunnery sergeant with 3 combat tours behind him, approached me after a session in San Diego. He waited until everyone else had left the room. "I've never told anyone this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not my wife, not my buddies, not the shrinks at the VA." He looked down at his hands. "In Fallujah, 2004, we were clearing houses and my team got hit bad. I took shrapnel to the neck, nicked my carotid, bled out right there on the floor of some Iraqi family's living room." He described leaving his body, watching the corpsmen working frantically to save him, feeling an overwhelming peace despite the chaos. "I saw my grandfather," he said. "He died when I was in boot camp. He told me it wasn't my time, that I needed to go back for my kids." The Marine's eyes met mine. "How did he know I had kids?" "My wife was pregnant with our first when I deployed, and my grandfather never knew." Stories like his convinced me that what I'd experienced wasn't unique or special. It was part of a pattern, a glimpse of something real that many people had touched in different ways. The more I shared my story, the more such accounts I heard in return. Not everyone was receptive, of course. The first time I spoke to a larger group, at a PTSD conference in Dallas, a psychiatrist in the audience interrupted me halfway through. What you're describing, he said loudly, is a classic hallucination caused by cerebral hypoxia. Your brain was oxygen deprived and created a comforting illusion to cope with impending death. It's well documented. I'd anticipated this response. In fact, I'd spent months reading the scientific literature on NDEs, including the various neurological explanations offered for them. That's one theory, I acknowledged, and it might be the right one. I can't prove otherwise. I paused. But let me ask you this. If what I experienced was just misfiring neurons, why did I come back fundamentally changed? Why did I return with information I couldn't have known otherwise? Why have thousands of people across cultures and throughout history reported such similar experiences? The psychiatrist didn't have a ready answer, and something in my calm certainty seemed to give him pause. After the talk, he approached me privately. I'm not saying I believe you, he said, but I've worked with dying patients for 20 years, and I've heard things that my medical training doesn't adequately explain. He handed me his card. If you're ever interested in participating in research on this phenomenon, please contact me. That was the beginning of my involvement with the scientific study of NDS. Over the next few years, I participated in several research programs, underwent cognitive and psychological assessments, and even had my brain activity monitored during meditation and recollection of my experience. The researchers were particularly interested in the changes in my personality and cognition following the NDE. The test confirmed what I already knew. I had undergone profound alterations in how I processed information, experienced emotions, and related to others. Your brain shows patterns we typically only see in long-term meditators. One neuroscientist told me, showing me scans with areas lit up in bright colors, particularly in the regions associated with empathy and emotional regulation. And your recall abilities are off the charts. The enhanced memory was one of the most noticeable changes. I could remember conversations verbatim from years earlier. I could recall sensory details, smells, sounds, textures, with perfect clarity. It wasn't just that I remembered more. I remembered differently, as if the information was stored in a more accessible, more complete way. But the most profound change was in how I perceived others. I had always been reasonably empathetic. You don't make it as a squad leader without some ability to read your people. But now it was like I could feel what others were feeling. Not in some mystical mind-reading way, but through a heightened awareness of subtle cues in expression, posture, and voice that I would have missed before. This new sensitivity made some social situations overwhelming. Crowds were particularly difficult. Too many emotions, too many energies colliding. I found myself needing more solitude than before, more time to process and integrate. During this period, I also began exploring various spiritual and philosophical traditions, looking for frameworks that might help me understand what I'd experienced. I read the mystics of different religions, Rumi and Saint John of the Cross, Buddhist texts and Hindu Upanishads, indigenous wisdom traditions and modern philosophical works. What struck me most was how many common threads ran through these seemingly different approaches to the transcendent. The direct experience of oneness, of a love beyond human categories, of consciousness as fundamental rather than incidental to the universe. These themes appeared again and again across cultures and centuries. I wasn't looking to join a religion or adopt a specific spiritual path. What I'd experienced felt beyond any particular tradition, though I could see reflections of it in many. I was more interested in practical wisdom. How does one live in light of the understanding that we are more than our physical bodies, that love is the fundamental reality, that death is a transition rather than an ending? 3 years after my NDE, I had an experience that convinced me beyond any remaining doubt that what I'd encountered was real. I was speaking at a support group for families who had lost service members in Afghanistan. After my talk, a woman in her 50s approached me. She introduced herself as Karen Williams, mother of Lieutenant James Williams. My son died in Kandahar in 2010, she said. Helicopter crashed during a medevac mission. She handed me a photograph of a young officer standing beside a Black Hawk. Did you see him there? In that place you described? I started to give my usual gentle response, that I hadn't recognized specific individuals other than what seemed like my grandfather. that the experience was more about a general understanding than particular encounters. But as I looked at the photo, something strange happened. A memory surfaced, not from my life, but from the experience itself. A presence that had been there, one of many I had sensed but not focused on. He was a helicopter pilot. I said the words coming without conscious thought. He loved the mountains at sunrise. He was worried about his younger brother following him into the service. Karen Williams went pale. James's brother enlisted 6 months after he died. She whispered, "Against our wishes." James used to text me photos of the Hindu Kush at dawn from his helicopter. He said it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. She gripped my arm. "How could you know these things?" I had no rational explanation. I had never met Lieutenant Williams in life. His name hadn't been familiar to me. We hadn't served in the same unit or at the same time. And yet somehow in that space beyond physical reality, something of him had communicated with something of me, and that information had remained accessible even after my return. This wasn't the only such incident. As I continued speaking publicly about my experience, other validations occurred. Specific details about deceased individuals that I couldn't have known, confirmed by their astonished family members. Information about places and events I had never witnessed in my physical life, but could describe with uncanny accuracy. I became careful about how and when I shared these experiences. I didn't want to become a psychic or a medium. That wasn't my purpose. And it felt like a distraction from the more important message I'd been given. But these validations served to strengthen my own conviction and to comfort those who needed it most. By the 5th anniversary of my NDE, my story had spread beyond military circles. I was invited to speak at universities, hospitals, hospices, and community organizations. I appeared on a few podcasts and smaller radio shows, though I declined opportunities for major media appearances. This wasn't about publicity or building a platform. It was about sharing a truth that people needed to hear, especially those facing death or grieving loved ones. One of the most meaningful engagements was at a children's hospital in Houston, speaking to the staff who worked with terminally ill kids. These medical professionals dealt with death regularly, watching children face the unimaginable with a courage that often put adults to shame. Many of the staff were burning out, the emotional toll of their work crushing their spirits. The hardest part, one oncology nurse told me, is not knowing what to say. When a 10-year-old asks you if dying hurts, or if they'll see their dog in heaven, or if their parents will be okay without them, what do you say? I didn't offer easy platitudes or claim to have all the answers, but I could share what I'd experienced, the profound love and acceptance I'd felt, the sense that death was not an ending, but a transition, the understanding that our connections to those we love transcend physical separation. After that talk, a pediatric palliative care doctor pulled me aside. "I've been doing this work for 15 years, she said. "I've been with hundreds of children as they died. And so many of them, in their final moments, speak of seeing loved ones who have passed, or describe beautiful lights, or express a joy that makes no sense given their circumstances." She wiped away tears. "I've always wondered if it was just the medications, or the dying brain's final attempt at comfort. But after hearing you today, I think maybe they're glimpsing where they're going. And that changes everything about how I do my job." These moments, when my story connected with someone's experience in a way that brought healing or new perspective, were what kept me going through the difficulties. And there were difficulties. Some religious groups attacked me for promoting New Age deception or demonic influences. Some scientific skeptics dismissed me as delusional or accused me of fabricating my experience for attention. The Veterans Administration, while allowing me to speak at some of their facilities, maintained an official stance of neutrality on the validity of NDEs. My family's reactions were mixed. My father, a pragmatic former construction worker, struggled with the metaphysical aspects of my story, but supported me because he could see how it had healed me. "I don't understand half of what you're talking about," he told me once. "But you're more at peace than I've ever seen you, so you must be doing something right." My mother, who had maintained a casual relationship with her Catholic upbringing, found in my experience a confirmation of her faith, though not in the dogmatic way her church taught. "I always knew there was more," she said. "I just didn't know what it looked like." My younger brother, who had nearly followed me into the military before choosing college instead, was the most skeptical. "I want to believe you," he said after one of my talks that he attended, "but it's a lot to accept without experiencing it myself." I understood his hesitation. If our positions were reversed, I might have felt the same. The Mike Dawson who enlisted at 19 would certainly have scoffed at the story I now told. That skepticism, that demand for evidence and logical explanation, was part of who I'd been. I couldn't expect others to abandon it more easily than I had. What surprised me most during these years was how my relationship with my own trauma evolved. The memories of that day in Afghanistan, the explosion, the deaths of my friends, the physical agony, didn't disappear, but they changed in quality, becoming less intrusive, less emotionally overwhelming. I could recall them with perfect clarity, but they no longer carried the same power to devastate me. This wasn't about forgetting or suppressing. If anything, my recall was more complete than before, but I now held those memories in a broader context that gave them new meaning. The suffering was real, the loss was real, but they weren't the whole story. They were threads in a larger tapestry whose full pattern I had glimpsed, if not fully comprehended. Traditional PTSD treatments had helped me manage symptoms, but this deeper transformation came from the perspective shift the NDE had given me. My trauma wasn't healed by forgetting. It was integrated through understanding its place in a larger whole. This integration extended to how I viewed my military service in general. I had enlisted out of a genuine desire to serve, to protect, to be part of something larger than myself. But like many veterans, I had struggled with moral injury. The harm to the conscience that comes from witnessing or participating in actions that violate one's core moral beliefs, even when those actions are sanctioned or necessary in war. My NDE hadn't erased these moral complexities, but it had shown me a perspective from which they could be held differently. I had experienced directly and undeniably that every human being, friend or enemy, American or Afghan, was connected in a web of consciousness that transcended our temporary identities and conflicts. This didn't make the hard choices of combat any easier, but it did place them in a context that allowed for healing rather than endless self-recrimination. About 6 years after my NDE, I received an unexpected email from Dr. Elizabeth Harmon, a neuroscientist at the University of Arizona who specialized in consciousness studies. She had heard me speak at a conference and was interested in including me in a research project on long-term changes in people who had experienced NDEs. We're particularly interested in cases like yours. She wrote, where the experience occurred in a combat situation and was accompanied by significant physical trauma. The combination of psychological and neurological factors makes these cases especially valuable for understanding the relationship between brain activity and consciousness. I agreed to participate, partly out of curiosity about how science might explain my experience, and partly because I believed that bridging the gap between spiritual experience and scientific understanding was important. If my story could contribute to that bridge building, I wanted to help. The research involved extensive brain scans, psychological assessments, and in-depth interviews about both my NDE and the changes I'd experienced since. Dr. Harmon's approach was refreshingly open-minded, neither dismissing the possibility of consciousness extending beyond the brain, nor abandoning scientific rigor in exploring it. The data from NDEs challenges our current models of consciousness, she told me as we reviewed some preliminary findings. The standard view is that consciousness is produced by the brain, but experiences like yours suggest it might be more accurate to say consciousness works through the brain, but isn't limited to it. She showed me scans of my brain activity compared to both normal controls and other NDE experiencers. Your patterns are consistent with what we're seeing in other cases. Increased coherence between different regions, enhanced activity in areas associated with empathy and emotional processing, and some interesting changes in how memory is encoded and accessed. Does that prove anything? I asked. About what actually happened to me? She smiled. Science doesn't prove or disprove experiences like yours. It can only document the changes that accompany them and try to understand the mechanisms involved. She tapped the scans. What I can tell you is that these changes are consistent with your reported experience and cannot be easily explained as products of suggestion or confabulation. Something profound happened to your brain, or to your consciousness as it relates to your brain. The exact nature of that something remains an open question. Dr. Harmon's research eventually contributed to a book on consciousness and near-death experiences, in which my case was featured prominently. The book didn't claim to settle the debate about what NDEs represent, but it helped legitimize their study within mainstream science and challenge the reflexive dismissal of such experiences as mere hallucinations. As my story reached more people, I began receiving invitations internationally. I was hesitant at first. Speaking about my experience was emotionally demanding, and I was still dealing with the physical limitations from my injuries. But when the opportunity came to address a conference on combat trauma and spiritual resilience in London, with military personnel from NATO countries in attendance, I decided to accept. The conference was a turning point. For the first time, I was speaking not just to individual service members or small groups, but to people who shaped policy and training for thousands of troops. Military psychologists, chaplains, medical personnel, and officers from a dozen countries listened as I described both my NDE and its implications for understanding and treating combat trauma. The standard model treats PTSD as primarily a dysfunction of fear responses, I told them, and that's part of it. But what I and many others have experienced suggests there's also a spiritual dimension to trauma, a confrontation with mortality and meaning that goes beyond neurochemistry. I propose that acknowledging the spiritual questions raised by combat about life and death, purpose and meaning, good and evil, might be essential to true healing for many veterans. Not by imposing any particular religious framework, but by creating space for warriors to wrestle with these questions honestly. When you've died, even temporarily, I said, when you've felt your consciousness separate from your body, when you've experienced a reality beyond the physical, it changes how you relate to everything, including your trauma. We need approaches that honor that experience rather than pathologizing it or reducing it to brain chemistry. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Military leaders from the UK, Canada, France, and several other countries approached me afterward, interested in incorporating these perspectives into their trauma care programs. A British colonel who had served in Iraq told me, "This is what's been missing from our approach. We've gotten better at addressing the psychological aspects of combat trauma, but we've been reluctant to engage with the spiritual dimensions." The conference led to consulting work with several military organizations, helping them develop more holistic approaches to combat trauma that acknowledge the spiritual questions it often raised. I was careful to maintain that this wasn't about promoting any particular religious viewpoint, but about recognizing that confronting death often triggers profound questions about the nature of reality itself. Questions that many existing treatment models weren't equipped to address. During this period of international travel and speaking, I had an experience that shed new light on a question that had lingered since my NDE. Why me? Why had I been allowed or made to return when others hadn't? What determined who stayed and who came back? I was in Germany speaking at a military hospital when I met a nurse named Anna who had served in Afghanistan around the same time I was there. After my talk, she asked if we could speak privately. "I was at the field hospital at Bagram when they brought you in," she said when we found a quiet corner. "I wasn't part of the trauma team that worked on you, but I remember the case. You were about as close to gone as I've ever seen someone come back from." We talked about that day, her memories from the hospital side, mine from elsewhere. Then she said something that stopped me cold. There was another soldier brought in at almost the same time. Similar injuries, IED blast, multiple traumas. The teams worked on both of you side by side. She paused. "He didn't make it." "Who was he?" I asked, something tightening in my chest. "Staff Sergeant Marcus Rivera. 10th Mountain, like you." I knew Rivera. Not well. He was in a different company, but we'd crossed paths several times at the fire base. Good soldier, quiet, kept to himself but took care of his people. "I've always wondered," Anna continued, "why one of you came back and one didn't. The injuries were comparable. The medical care was identical. Why you and not him?" The question hit a nerve. In my darkest moments, I'd asked myself the same thing about my squad members who died that day. Why had I returned while Reynolds, Williamson, and Chen hadn't? Was it random? Was it some purpose I was meant to fulfill? Was it simply a matter of medical luck? The exact angle of the shrapnel? The precise timing of the medevac? I don't know, I admitted. During my experience, I was shown that I had things I needed to return for. Work that wasn't finished. But I can't believe Rivera didn't have unfinished business too. He had a family, a future. He had a wife and 2 young daughters. Anna confirmed. They came to Bagram after he died. She didn't need to finish the sentence. I could imagine all too clearly. That night in my hotel room, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Rivera, about the randomness and the purpose that seemed to coexist in who lived and who died. If my experience was real, and I believed with every fiber of my being that it was, then Rivera hadn't simply ceased to exist. He had transitioned to wherever I had briefly visited, but that didn't diminish the loss his family had suffered, the years of life he might have had, the father he would never be to his growing daughters. In the early hours of the morning, something unexpected happened. As I lay in the darkness, thinking about Rivera, I felt a presence in the room. Not a physical presence, not something I could see with my eyes, but something I recognized immediately from my NDE. A consciousness, a being of light and awareness. And somehow I knew it was Rivera. There were no words, no dramatic ghostly appearance. Just a certainty, a knowing, and a wave of emotion that wasn't mine. A complex mixture of peace, sadness, gratitude, and something like encouragement. The message, if it could be called that, was simple. It's all unfolding as it should. Both our paths, his in death, mine in life, were necessary, were right. We're part of a pattern neither of us could fully comprehend from our limited perspectives. The experience lasted perhaps a minute before the presence faded. I was left with tears streaming down my face and a profound sense of both humility and purpose. I couldn't claim to understand the full design, couldn't pretend to know why some died while others lived, but I could trust that there was a design, that our lives and deaths were not random, meaningless events, but threads in a tapestry of unimaginable complexity and beauty. The next morning, I asked Anna if she knew how to contact Rivera's family. A week later, I was sitting in a small house in Colorado Springs with Maria Rivera and her daughters, now 10 and 12. I hadn't planned to tell them about my experience in the hotel room. It seemed too strange, too potentially unsettling. But as Maria showed me photos of Marcus and told me stories of their life together, I felt that same presence, that same certainty. "I need to tell you something," I said finally. "It might sound strange, and you don't have to believe it or make sense of it, but I think it's something I'm meant to share with you." I told her about my NDE first, the bare outlines of it, and then about the experience in Germany. I tried to convey the feeling, the certainty, the message I had received without embellishing or interpreting too much. Maria listened silently, her eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, she didn't speak for a long time. Then she stood up, went to a drawer, and returned with a journal. "The girls and I have been seeing a grief counselor since Marcus died," she said. "She suggested I keep a journal of anything unusual that might happen. Dreams, coincidences, moments when I felt Marcus might be present." She opened the journal to a marked page. This is from about a week ago. She read aloud an entry describing how she had awakened in the night with an overwhelming sense that Marcus was in the room with her. She had felt engulfed in his love, in his presence, in a certainty that he was okay and that they would be together again. The experience had left her with a peace she hadn't felt since his death. The date of her experience matched exactly with the night I had felt Rivera's presence in Germany. "I've never told anyone about this," she said, closing the journal. "Not even the counselor. I was afraid they would think I was not coping well." She looked at me with eyes that held both tears and a new steadiness. "But it was real, wasn't it? He was really there." "I believe he was," I said, "and still is, in ways we can't fully comprehend." That visit with the Rivera family crystallized something important for me. The message I had been given to share wasn't just about what happens after we die. It was about the connections that bind us to each other, connections that death doesn't sever but transforms. It was about the continuity of consciousness, the permanence of love, the unbroken web that holds all beings. This understanding shaped the next phase of my work. I began focusing less on the details of the afterlife experience itself and more on its implications for how we live and relate to each other here and now. If consciousness continues, if our connections transcend physical death, if love is the fundamental reality, then how might that change how we approach our lives, our relationships, our sufferings? I developed a workshop called Living in Light of the Larger Story, which I offered to veterans groups, hospice organizations, and grief support communities. The workshop didn't try to convince people of any particular metaphysical view, but invited them to consider how their lives might be different if they lived as though their consciousness and connections were eternal. For many participants, just entertaining this possibility, even hypothetically, opened new avenues for healing and growth. Veterans who had been tormented by survivor's guilt found peace in the idea that their fallen comrades continued to exist and that the bonds between them remained intact. People grieving loved ones found comfort not in platitudes about heaven, but in a lived sense of ongoing connection and communication. One veteran, a former Marine who had lost both legs in Iraq, told me after a workshop, "I've been angry at God, at the world, at myself for years. Angry about what was taken from me. But if what you're saying is true, If this physical life is just one chapter in a much longer story, then maybe I haven't lost as much as I thought. Maybe what matters most can never be taken away. Around the 8th anniversary of my NDE, I received an invitation that took my work in an unexpected direction. A documentary filmmaker named Sarah Chen, no relation to my fallen squad member, had heard me speak at a conference and wanted to make a film about near-death experiences in combat situations, with my story as the central narrative. I was hesitant. I had deliberately kept a low profile, declining opportunities for major media exposure. My concern wasn't about personal privacy, but about maintaining the integrity of the message. I'd seen how profound spiritual experiences could be sensationalized or commercialized in ways that degraded their meaning. But something about Sarah's approach resonated with me. She wasn't interested in creating a supernatural thriller or a religious propaganda piece. She wanted to explore the human dimensions of these experiences, how they changed people, how they influenced their understanding of life and death, how they affected their relationships and choices. What interests me, she said when we met to discuss the project, is not just what people believe they saw or experienced, but how it transformed them. Whether these experiences are glimpses of an actual afterlife or products of the dying brain, they have real and lasting effects on those who have them. That's a story worth telling. I agreed to participate with the understanding that the film would include multiple perspectives, not just my story, but the experiences of other veterans, the views of scientists and medical professionals, and the insights of spiritual leaders from various traditions. The filming process was more challenging than I had anticipated. Revisiting the most traumatic day of my life in detail, on camera, opened wounds I thought had healed. Describing the beauty and peace of the experience while trying to convey its profound emotional impact left me drained and vulnerable. And knowing that my story would now reach thousands or even millions of people brought a weight of responsibility I hadn't fully anticipated. But the process was also healing in unexpected ways. Sarah insisted on filming at locations that were significant to my story, including bringing me back to Afghanistan, to the province where I had been wounded. With appropriate security and permissions, we visited the area where my patrol had been ambushed. It was my first time back since being medevaced out 8 years earlier. The landscape was simultaneously familiar and strange. The mountains still stood impassive against the sky. The village had changed little. Mud brick buildings, narrow streets, children playing in the dust. But I had changed, and my relationship to this place had changed. Standing on the approximate spot where I had died, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Grief for the men who had died there, gratitude for the second chance I had been given, awe at the journey that had brought me from that moment to this one. But more than anything, I felt a profound peace. The trauma that had once been attached to this place had been transformed, integrated into a larger understanding that could hold both the horror of that day and the transcendent beauty of what followed it. The documentary, titled Beyond the Light: Near-Death Experiences in Combat, was released the following year. It featured my story along with those of 5 other veterans who had had NDEs in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. It included interviews with neuroscientists, trauma specialists, and spiritual leaders from various traditions. Rather than arguing for any particular interpretation, it presented the experiences and their effects, allowing viewers to draw their own conclusions. The film won several awards at independent festivals and was eventually picked up by a major streaming service. Suddenly, my story was reaching people far beyond the military and spiritual communities where I had been speaking. I began receiving hundreds of emails and messages daily, from veterans sharing similar experiences they had never told anyone, from people grieving loved ones who found comfort in the film's message, from scientists interested in studying these phenomena more deeply. The increased visibility brought challenges as well. Some religious groups embraced the film as evidence for their particular version of the afterlife, while others condemned it as spiritually dangerous. Scientific skeptics published critiques arguing that all NDEs could be explained by neurochemical processes in the dying brain. I found myself positioned as an authority on matters I still considered largely mysterious, expected to have answers to questions that I believed were ultimately unanswerable in conventional terms. I navigated these waters carefully, trying to maintain fidelity to my experience without overextending its implications. When asked if NDEs prove the existence of heaven or God, I would reply, they suggest that consciousness may continue beyond physical death, but how we interpret that continuation is shaped by our beliefs and cultural context. When confronted with neurological explanations, I would acknowledge their plausibility while noting, even if NDEs are produced by brain activity, that doesn't explain why they create such profound and lasting transformations, or why they so often include verifiable perceptions that should have been impossible given the person's physical state. The documentary led to opportunities I hadn't anticipated. I was invited to speak at medical schools about the implications of NDEs for end-of-life care. I consulted with hospice organizations developing programs to support both dying patients and their families through the transition of death. I worked with military chaplains to create resources for spiritual care that honored the diverse experiences and beliefs of service members while addressing the profound questions raised by combat. Throughout this period of wider recognition, I continued to receive validations of my experience that defied conventional explanation. People I had never met would approach me after talks with specific details about their deceased loved ones that I had somehow seen during my time in that other realm. Information would come to me about places and events I had no normal way of knowing about. These experiences remained mysterious to me. I couldn't control them or summon them at will, but they reinforced my conviction that what I had experienced was not merely a hallucination or a product of my brain's chemistry. One such incident occurred after a talk at a veterans center in Minnesota. A woman in her 70s waited until everyone else had left before approaching me. "You mentioned seeing rows of lights while you were on the other side," she said, each light representing a soul or consciousness. I nodded. This was one aspect of my experience I had described, seeing what appeared to be countless points of light, each containing entire worlds of experience, all connected in a vast network. "My son Thomas died in Vietnam in 1971, she continued. "For years after his death, I would dream about him standing among rows of lights, trying to communicate something to me. I never told anyone about those dreams. They seemed too strange, too personal." She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "How could you know what I saw in private dreams 50 years ago?" I had no rational explanation, but I had long since moved beyond needing rational explanations for every aspect of my experience. Some things I had come to believe could be true and real without conforming to our limited understanding of how reality works. As the 10th anniversary of my NDE approached, I found myself reflecting on how profoundly it had changed the course of my life. From a skeptical, practically minded soldier, I had become someone whose life was dedicated to exploring and sharing the implications of a glimpse beyond the veil of physical reality. From someone whose identity was built around military service and combat readiness, I had become a bridge between worlds, the material and the spiritual, the military and civilian, the scientific and the mystical. The message I had been given to share had evolved and deepened over the years, shaped by the thousands of conversations I'd had, the research I'd participated in, the personal validations I'd received, and my own ongoing integration of the experience. What had started as a simple testimony, "Consciousness continues, love persists, we are more than our bodies," had developed into a more nuanced understanding of how these truths might transform how we live, how we relate to each other, how we face suffering and death. I no longer saw my role as convincing skeptics or providing proof of an afterlife. I had come to believe that such proof may be inherently impossible within the framework of our current scientific paradigms. Instead, I focused on creating spaces where people could explore these questions for themselves, where those who had had similar experiences could speak without fear of ridicule, and where the profound implications of consciousness continuing beyond death could be considered seriously. On the exact anniversary of my NDE, I returned to the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, where I had spent months recovering from my physical injuries. I had been invited to give a talk to medical staff and wounded warriors about resilience and healing after combat trauma. As I stood at the podium, looking out at the faces before me, doctors who had treated countless broken bodies, nurses who had witnessed both miraculous recoveries and devastating losses, and young men and women whose lives had been forever altered by war, I felt the weight of the decade that had passed since my own wounding and transformation. 10 years ago today, I died on a dusty road in Afghanistan. For approximately 4 minutes, by medical standards, I ceased to be alive. My heart stopped beating. My brain activity flatlined. For all clinical purposes, Staff Sergeant Michael Dawson was dead. I paused, looking around the room. But I didn't cease to exist. My consciousness, my self, my awareness, whatever you want to call it, continued. It expanded. It experienced things that should have been impossible if consciousness is only a product of brain activity. And when I was resuscitated, when I returned to this body, I came back changed in ways that medicine still struggles to explain. I shared the broad outlines of my experience, focusing less on the details of what I had seen and felt in that other realm, and more on how it had transformed my understanding of life, death, suffering, and healing. I'm not here to convince you of any particular interpretation of what happened to me. I told them, I'm here to suggest that what we call trauma and healing may be more complex, more mysterious, and more profound than our current models acknowledge. That the line between psychological and spiritual experience may be more blurry than we've been taught to believe, and that listening to those who have crossed boundaries between life and death, between material and transcendent reality, might offer insights valuable to both medicine and our shared humanity. I spoke about the research I'd participated in, the patterns that had emerged across thousands of documented NDEs, the lasting neurological and psychological changes that often accompanied these experiences. I shared stories of how acknowledging the spiritual dimensions of trauma had facilitated healing for many veterans, where purely psychological or pharmacological approaches had fallen short. The most important thing I've learned in these 10 years, I concluded, is that love is real, not just as an emotion or a biochemical process, but as a fundamental aspect of reality itself. The connections between us, between all conscious beings, are not imaginary or temporary, but essential and eternal. Death transforms these connections but does not break them. I looked out at the wounded warriors in the audience, some missing limbs, some bearing visible scars, all carrying invisible ones. Your bodies may be damaged, but you are not broken. What makes you who you are, your consciousness, your capacity for love and connection, cannot be destroyed by bullets or bombs or IEDs. I know this not as a religious belief or a comforting philosophy, but as a direct experience. And in that knowledge, I have found a peace that all the therapy and medication in the world could not provide. After the talk, a young Army specialist approached me. He was in a wheelchair, both legs amputated above the knee, his right arm ending at the elbow. I've been trying to kill myself for the past year, he said without preamble. 3 attempts. They keep saving me, putting me on more meds, more therapy. He looked up at me with clear eyes. But listening to you today, for the first time, I'm wondering if maybe I'm not supposed to die yet, if maybe there's something I'm still here to do. I knelt beside his wheelchair so we were at eye level. I can't tell you why you're still here, I said, but I can tell you that your life has purpose and meaning, even if you can't see it right now. Not because that's a nice thing to believe, but because that's the nature of reality as I've experienced it. Nothing, no life, no suffering, no moment of consciousness is random or meaningless. It's all connected in ways we can barely comprehend. He nodded slowly. I'm not sure I believe it yet, he said, but I want to, and that's more than I had yesterday. That conversation encapsulated what my work had become. Not providing absolute answers or irrefutable proofs, but offering possibilities, perspectives, and personal testimony that might open doors for others to find their own healing and meaning. As I look to the future, I don't know exactly where this path will lead. The research into NDEs and consciousness continues to evolve, with new technologies and methodologies offering possibilities for understanding that weren't available even a few years ago. My own role in sharing these experiences and their implications continues to develop and change. But certain things remain constant. The certainty that consciousness continues beyond physical death. The understanding that love and connection are not temporary but eternal. The knowledge that suffering, while real and significant, exists within a larger context that gives it meaning and purpose. And the commitment to sharing these truths with those who need them most, the dying, the grieving, the traumatized, the lost. I still carry the physical scars of that day in Afghanistan. My right leg will never be fully functional. The traumatic brain injury left subtle cognitive effects that I've learned to compensate for, but never completely overcome. I still dream of Reynolds, Williamson, and Chen, not nightmares now, but vivid encounters that often feel more like visits than dreams. But I also carry the light I experienced, the understanding I was given, the purpose that has shaped my second chance at life. I carry the thousands of conversations with people whose lives have been touched by this story, the countless moments of connection and healing that have flowed from one violent day that nearly ended my life, but instead transformed it. I died in Afghanistan. An RPG tore through my body and stopped my heart, For 4 minutes, by our earthly reckoning, I ceased to be alive. But in those 4 minutes, I experienced an eternity. I saw my entire life in a flash. Not just the past, but the connections, the meaning, the purpose underlying everything. And I came back with a message that I'm still learning how to fully articulate. We are more than our bodies. Consciousness continues. Love persists. Nothing is lost. And the light that I glimpsed, that infinite loving awareness that holds all being, is our true home, our true nature, our true destiny. This is not the end of my story. In many ways, it feels like just the beginning. There is more to learn, more to understand, more to share. But if there's one thing I know with absolute certainty, it's this: death is not what we think it is. Life is more meaningful than we dare to hope. And love is the thread that connects everything, the force that survives when everything else falls away. I know because I died. And I came back to tell you.